Hello, everyone. We are looking at what is critical thinking today, somewhat of like an introduction to the study of critical thinking. So we're kind of going to be covering an overview of the kind of definition of critical thinking, how to critical think. Of course, we're going to engage in the how to critical think through the rest of the semester, but a brief overview of that. What kind of skills critical thinkers have, how critical thinking impacts daily life, those types of things. So the first thing I wanted to take a look at are some quotes about critical thinking. The first two are about critical thinking. The third we're going to change to critical thinking, and then the fourth one is an example of what happens when you don't critically think. So the first quote here is critical thinking is thinking about your thinking while you're thinking in order to make your thinking better. And I like this one. It has five thinkings in the quote, but it works in the sense of, besides just being fun to say and read, it works with the idea that the study of critical thinking really is thinking about thinking. So we can simplify that quote a little bit. But that's what we're doing. We're looking at how, why we think the way we do, how to think a certain way, the steps to thinking that way. And so we're analyzing and examining thinking. And so I thought it was appropriate for that. This next quote is, the essence of the independent mind lies not in what it thinks, but how it thinks. And I really like this one. So it's you have here, the not in what it thinks, but in how it thinks. And as I mentioned with that, that's one of the aspects of the study of critical thinking, is this idea of looking at how the topic, the content, right, isn't the key, but how you approach whatever topic you're thinking about. The next one is, thinking is the hardest work there is, which is probably the reason so few engage in it. Now, it's by Henry Ford. It's a little bit harsh, right? He's implying that most people don't think, which of course doesn't work out. People are always thinking. You can't not think, right? So it's not accurate in that sense because, people are always thinking. It certainly is trying to be sarcastic about the idea that most people aren't thinking more than surface level, which is why if we adapt this quote to say critical thinking is the hardest work there is, which is probably the reason so few engage with it, I would argue that is a very accurate quote. And especially because the idea is that, thinking just happens. It's habitual, it's subconscious. You can't get around it, right? But critical thinking is not habitual for a lot of people. It's not always a subconscious act. And it is often hard work. Now, this varies. There are levels of critical thinking. There's lower level critical thinking, and we're going to look at an example of that lower level critical thinking that many people might not even consider critical thinking. And I think that one's going to be a good example to highlight how we do critically think on a regular basis without even really being aware of it. But there's also higher level critical thinking, and that stuff does take effort and time, because critical thinking, if you're consciously doing it, requires you to slow down. It requires you to stop and ask questions, to analyze, to evaluate, to gather information, to make inferences, all ultimately to make an informed and hopefully accurate decision for whatever problem you're trying to solve, or decision you want to make, or belief you are going to believe in. And it's easier just to not do that. Now, the good news is, the more that you practice, the more that you engage in critical thinking, it does become habitual and it becomes easier. You start doing it, even higher level critical thinking, you start doing without really having to consciously work through the stages and steps of critical thinking. That still doesn't mean that, like, there are even someone who is someone who uses critical thinking on a regular basis could still end up with, like, if you're really, diving deep into a topic, it can be time consuming and hard. But there is definitely a process of which that practice, that repeated use that makes something a regular part of your life, makes you go through the motions and the actions of being a critical thinker without having to think too much about it, at least on the process. You're still thinking hard in terms of evaluating and analyzing, but you're not also having on top of that to think about the process and saying, am I going through the steps that are necessary? Am I covering all my bases? Right? Those things just become ingrained, and that makes it easier. Now, the last quote is an example again of what happens when one doesn't critically think. And this quote's been around and it was attributed to Winston Churchill. And this is something that has long been attributed to Winston Churchill. So it's not a new thing, but it came back into the news because Ron DeSantis, or probably his writing team, used this quote in his speech to say that he wasn't going to be running for president anymore. And he provided this quote, and he said that, Winston Churchill wrote it, or said it, not probably wrote it. The thing is, it is not by Winston Churchill. That has long been attributed to him. So the question kind of becomes, how did DeSantis or his team fail to use critical thinking and end up with this mistake? And so I wanted to look at, how that kind of happens with that, and then thinking about what would you do, and how does critical thinking come into play here to not make this mistake in the future. Now, again, to be fair to Ron DeSantis, he's not the first one to misattribute this to Winston Churchill. It has become part of popular culture that Winston Churchill has said this. So that makes it harder, right? It's not something that no one else has said, and then someone comes up and claims that, oh yeah, was by this person, and everyone's like, no, it's not. It's something that many people have believed, have put up on social media, have restated. So if we look at how did they fail to use critical thinking to end up with this mistake, we can take a look at an internet search here to see, not that one yet, what is happening. So I went to Google and I just put in the quote. And the first thing that pops up here is images of Winston Churchill with that quote, right? And now, of course, it talks about Ron DeSantis and the quote, but when he was looking this up, or his team was looking this up, it didn't have that, right? A quote by Winston Churchill, right, by Goodreads, right? So even if you started to scroll down, if we take out all the ones where it's talking about Ron DeSantis, because that just happened, and obviously they didn't have that, you see over and over again that Winston Churchill is referenced in this. And the reality is that most people don't actually scroll past that first page on a web browser. So they see this and they go, okay, that's, there we go. Especially if, and there's two ways this worked, right? One is that they Googled it, like I did, or they Googled good motivational quotes. And if you Google good motivational quotes and select a couple different websites, some of them have the Winston Churchill quote that is not his quote, but attributed to him, misattributed to him in their list, right? So they could have just looked for motivational quotes, saw the one that said Winston Churchill and said, that looks great. And it's Winston Churchill, so bonus, right? Or they could have heard the quote before and then searched for it this way. If we go, I also did one in Microsoft Bing just to see the difference. And here, this one actually I think looks more official, right? The quote by Winston Churchill means this, and it basically explains it for you. Right now, this one, if you scroll a bit, it starts asking, did Churchill say this? And then we get DeSantis again. But you have this kind of very official looking thing. So if you already had this expectation and you were just trying to find the quote so you had the full quote, you would see this and it would support your current knowledge that you had on the quote. It would support your preconceived ideas about who said the quote, and you would stop looking, right? You may not look any further. So they didn't, they took one step and then stopped. In critical thinking then, like, so what would you do? Think about this for a second. Do you Google something, find the first kind of result and go, perfect, I'm good to go, and you stop looking, you stop right there? Or do you keep going, right? And in critical thinking, the idea is that we keep going. So what are ways that we could sit here and say, how do we avoid this mistake? Well, one would be to look up sources on Winston Churchill and see if this quote comes up in there. The next step would be also to evaluate those sources and make sure that those sources were valid sources, right? That isn't just someone's Instagram post or a random site that anyone can post to, but is a valid site. For example, the Winston Churchill Foundation. If it came from there, you can say, okay, with this source, this is the Winston Churchill Foundation. They're more likely to have, archives of his writings, know what he said, and be accurate. If it's a government site, if it's an EDU site, right? If it's a well-known source that is reliable and tends to be accurate, then you say, okay, so these sources are also saying this. You could also, look up and ask questions. This is a big part of critical thinking, and where you ask, which they do, right? If you scroll right here, did Winston Churchill say this quote? And then based on that, go, okay, I'm asking now if this is actually a quote that's from him. Was this quote from Winston Churchill? And start seeing what it says. The other would be is if you just scroll down and saw, again, don't see the Ron DeSantis one yet, but if they saw like, hey, there's a mix of people saying, yes, it is his quote, and then others saying, no, it's not, that you might start asking questions like, which one of these is accurate? How do I know which one of these is actually the correct one? And by continuing further, you move into the Tyrtonian realm of critical thinking rather than simply stopping at that first step in the process. So let's bring back up the PowerPoint here and go to the next one, if it was going to let me. All right, hang on. All right, I got it to get to the next slide. My computer is not liking me today. Okay, so what are some of the definitions of critical thinking, right? And there's lots. There's a basic definition of critical thinking, but if you look it up or you read several books on critical thinking, and they're all going to have slightly different definitions of critical thinking. And so I put several together to kind of, I think, get a well-rounded look at, what does critical thinking mean? So the first is it's a systematic evaluation or formation of beliefs or statements by rational standards. You do see a lot of this idea of rational, maybe not standards, so let's erase that line there. But this idea of rational, what I see it with is thought, right? This idea that it's that reasonable. But the other thing is this systematic evaluation is key too. That you're evaluating, and not just evaluating, systematic evaluation. That there's a process that you're going through systematically to evaluate a belief or statement, and you're doing so with a rational thought, right? Or standards or practices or whatever in that sense, right? The next one is it's the ability to think clearly. Here's the word rationally again, right? About what to do or what to believe. So we have, again, rationally. It is about deducing consequences, make use of information to solve problems, and to seek relevant sources of information to make informed decisions. Right? That's the end goal, essentially, with critical thinking, is how do I make informed decisions? How do I make the right decision for me and whatever I'm looking at? And the right decision is the informed decision that is not based on just emotion or misinformation or misdirection, right? So, and the way that this one is setting up like critical thinking, and this one's providing kind of the steps, deducing consequences, right? Making use of information to solve problems, and seeking relevant sources, right? And those three things then provide you informed decisions. And then it is about making reasoned judgments, again, not rational, but reasoned, which means decoding hidden assumptions and if it is true or false, right? So this again is looking at trying to determine whether something is accurate or not, and doing that through reasoned judgments. And again, right, if you put them all together, I think it provides a good overview of the definition of critical thinking. It's not about just collecting information. Knowing a bunch of facts can be fun, but it doesn't mean that you're a good critical thinker just because you know a lot of facts and can reiterate them, right? Because it's what you do with those facts. Essentially, critical thinking is an action. Oh, and my computer is slowing down again. This is what I'm talking about, of not having a fun day with the computer. Critical thinking is an action. It's not, it's a series of actions, really, right? It's not just a regurgitation of information. Because you can have someone that seems to know, information about everything. But if they can't then connect that further by then analyzing, evaluating, and making informed decisions from that knowledge, you are critical thinking. And I think that's the key, right? Is you do need that information, some of the facts and information. Like, you need to be able to discover that and work with that. But you have to be able to actually then do something with it, not just have it. That accurate and relevant information, to know the sources, to know what is quality information versus subpar information, is all part of that process. And then you take that information and you, here, it says decode the hidden assumptions, or another way of saying it is solve problems, right? Critical thinking helps us not only gain knowledge, but strengthen our arguments. And again, a lot of these, it's that making those decisions, coming to a final conclusion, if you will. All right, the next thing we're looking at is the key traits of critical thinkers. And so here are the list. Being inquisitive, right? That's the asking questions, right? That's what that is. And this is so central. Even if you, with everything else that we're going to look at, one of the things that's an easy thing to do is ask questions. So, right, if you're stuck on like, well, I don't know the process, I don't know what I should do next, ask questions, right? Because if you can ask questions, and if you think to ask questions, right off the bat, you're not accepting things at face value. You're not just seeing like on the internet with the Winston Churchill quote. Instead, you're stopping and thinking about and going, okay, what does this mean? Where is this from? The questions of how do you know that? What evidence do you have to support what you're saying? And are there alternatives to your point of view? Those are good questions. And we're going to look at those questions again in a little bit. But they're good questions to ask of how do you know that? And that's a basic one, right? Okay, someone told me this information, or I have this fact, or I read this thing. Well, how do we know that that's true? How do I know that, or how do I know this information, right? What if you're having a conversation with a friend and you say something that's, well, I believe this. Obviously, you could get into a whole thing with, just beliefs and the relativity of true and false with that. But the idea of, okay, why do you believe that? How do I know this information to believe this, right? And if you can't answer that, then the next step is to critically think about, where did this knowledge come from? Why do I believe this thing? If you're reading a source on the internet, how do I know that this is accurate? How do I know that this is factual? Right? And there's tons of more questions than this that we're going to be looking at, but that's like that basic one of how do you know that? How do you know it's true? How do you know it's factual? How do you know that this source is reliable? How do you know that this information is not trying to misdirect or mislead you? All of that's going to be part of that. And then evidence is key with this, right? Seeking evidence, right? This is it's the idea of essentially the proof to support your point or belief. Right? If you're going to say, okay, I want to make an informed decision, or I want to know if this news story is accurate, or I want to know if this politician's speech is reliable and accurate, right? Well, then you have to look at the evidence. This person's claiming this fact. Okay, how do I go about finding more about this fact? And one would be if you're talking to them, well, okay, where did you get your sources from, right? Where did you learn this? And then that can be, and then you can evaluate from there, right? Being able to expand on that. But it's also, if it's something you're reading, okay, who wrote this? What is the news outlet that is producing this? What do I know about them? Okay, they're quoting this from this. Where did they get their sources and information? Right? Because sources are super important. It supports and helps back up whatever claims someone's making, and it helps create a more informed decision, right? The next is adapting an attitude of healthy skepticism. And I think this goes with, we could put this with being inquisitive, in the sense that part of that is just not always believing. That could be the other thing with this, is not always believing everything right off the bat. Right? Okay, so in this sense, hard when it's delayed here. This idea of just because I read it, just because someone said it to me, how do I make sure that I'm not immediately going, yeah, okay, cool, that's true, fact absorbed kind of thing, right? Now, this doesn't mean you have to be argumentative or critical of people. Sometimes people mistake critical thinking to mean, oh, they're argumentative. Oh, they're always so critical of everything. It just means that, and it isn't certainly saying, it's a healthy skepticism here, guys. So, right, that is key with this, is healthy skepticism, right? You're not saying be a cynic, not saying disbelieve everything and immediately challenge the people, but don't make sure that you're not just accepting everything at face value. Make sure that when you're reading, listening to things, having conversations, that you are setting yourself up to think about what's being said and wondering, is this true? And there's some things like, if someone says the sky is blue, well, it's a known fact. You don't have to be skeptical of those type of things. But when it gets into deeper level things, right, then, or a person who has a history of lying, it would be good to be skeptical of that person rather than just to say anything they say I'm going to believe. Or, well, I read it on the internet. And I know that's the big joke of, oh, you read it on the internet. But the reality is that people are taken in by fake news all the time. People are taken in by scams and fake news all of the time. And they did. That's because they read it on the internet. And then they spread and share that information. And more people then read it, take it at face value, and spread and share the information. The other part with this, and this will, when we look at digital media, we'll talk more about this, but that is one of the pervasive nature of social media, is that as more and more people share something that becomes popular, there's no basis for whether it's actually accurate or not. Things show up in feeds and get shared more and then become front page when it is popular. So the more and the more it's popular, the more people share it. And the more that people share it and it's popular, the more likely, especially I think, people who have grown up with the internet tend to then see it and go, oh, well, everyone's talking about this, so it must be true, right? It's also what helps promote and create viral videos or hot items. The blow up with Stanley Cups, for example. Stanley has been around as a company forever, and it was definitely not popular. But you had some social media influencers that started promoting it. Some people saw it and started sharing it. More people started making videos about it, and it just blew up, right? And then everyone started liking Stanley Cups, but they were all heavily influenced into liking Stanley Cups because of really not questioning anything about it. Like, why should I like this cup? What's so good about it? Is this a cup I need? Why is this a cup that people are all of a sudden talking about? Right? None of those steps were taken. It was, I see so many people posting videos. This must be the hot new thing. I'm now interested in it. I'm going to go check it out and I want one. And then you're going to get into the craze. And I think especially people who end up sticking, like getting super, it's one thing to go buy a Stanley Cup, but the people that are like collecting one for each outfit and having all the colors to match their outfits, right? This kind of obsessive level of latching on to something is in part because critical thinking isn't taking place. And then being open to new ideas or the ideas of others, accepting the possibility that we may be wrong when confronted with contradicting evidence. I'm going to put, this is hard to do. All right. It is hard to, it's hard to change. You get stuck in your views and your beliefs, and it is very hard for people to change their point of view once they dig in. The reality is that if you really want to be a full critical thinker, you have to be willing to change. If you're completely closed off and unwilling to consider alternate viewpoints that conflict with your existing beliefs and viewpoints, you're not fully critically thinking. That's a hard thing to do because we tend to automatically dismiss the alternate viewpoints that contradict our belief systems. So if we've decided we believe in something, or we believe in someone, and other people to say, hey, that's not accurate, or this person is a pathological liar, right? Or this person doesn't have your interest at heart. But if you truly believe that they do, or that they are truthful, even when people present evidence to you, many people just outright dismiss it. Our brain is amazing at coming up with ways to dance around the whole thing and make new connections to things to try to justify and explain our beliefs in the face of oppositional evidence. And so what makes a good, strong critical thinker is someone who can say, okay, stop, my brain's wanting me to go to this defensive position. Why is that? Why am I getting defensive about this, right? Let's think. Now, being a critical thinker doesn't mean you have to change your beliefs or opinions. It means you're open and willing to, especially if you're presented with evidence that suggests that your views are inaccurate. So if I get dug in to say, no, Winston Churchill said that quote, I know it, I'm positive, and they're like, well, no, here's the quote, here's the article from and the interview from the Winston Churchill Foundation, who has all the archives of his writings and recorded stuff, statements and speeches he's given, and they say that they have found no evidence that he ever said this. And if you're a critical thinker, you say, oh, well, now I need to critically think about that information and go through the steps. If you're not critically thinking, you just say, well, that whatever, I know that this is a quote from Winston Churchill, or they're wrong. They just obviously don't have that information, right? Instead of sitting and saying, okay, well, let me explore if this is truly, accurate. And then once you do discover, yes, indeed, they're a legitimate source, they do have all of his archives and information, and in fact they're saying that it's not something he said, maybe I need to reassess in my belief that that is something he said. Again, depending on the stakes and stuff for it, right? There's higher and lower stakes with this stuff, but it is, no matter what, it is hard for us to do that. It's probably the hardest thing out of everything. All right, the next thing we're looking at is the kind of 3 key skills to a critical thinker. The first one is making informed decisions. In order to solve problems and make decisions, we need to gather information that will help us decide what to do. And this information can come from life experiences, research, education, other people, right? But the idea is, in order to make informed decisions, right, you have to gather information. Because it's hard to make a decision if you don't have any information on the topic, right? You're like, well, I don't know anything about that topic, so I can't really have a debate or argue or have a stance on that position because I don't know anything about it, or I don't know this person, so I can't tell you whether they are a good or bad person, right? But if you start gathering information, finding evidence, looking for that material, then that can provide that, right? So an example from this, and this is the low-level critical thinking that I was talking about, is a light bulb, we'll say example. And so with this, if let's say there's a light bulb that's too high for you to reach way up in the ceiling, right? And it's burned out, so you need to replace it. So how do you go about doing that? What are the steps you take to change that light bulb? What critical thinking skills are needed? Again, this is low-level critical thinking. This is critical thinking that people probably do on a regular basis, just based on life experience and what is around us, right? If this light bulb, and there is a difference, if this light bulb is in our home, we probably have had experience without even really thinking too much about it, just observational experience of how this light bulb has been changed in the past. If this is a light bulb in a place that you don't frequently go to, or your job is not normally, let's say, at the workplace to replace this light bulb, but you need to, you don't have the situational experience of observing how it's been done. So if it's at home, this is an easier issue than if it's somewhere else, right? And so that does take into account, right? And it's an easy enough situation that people have been in before, that they're able to figure out and how to solve because they've lived through that experience. They've seen others perform the task, and you have a basic understanding, ideally, of light bulbs and changing light bulbs. And how you can get yourself into a higher position from the floor. And there's the difference. If you ask a young kid, this is going to be a harder task than if you ask an adult, because an adult is going to know how to change a light bulb. An adult is going to know, like, hey, ladders, stools, chairs are all things I can step on to move me higher to the ceiling to reach it, where a younger kid may not have that experience yet and that knowledge, and they have to then figure it out from almost a disadvantage, from a further behind starting point than someone who's lived that experience, right? So you could stand on a stool, you could ask someone tall enough to reach it and to change it themselves. You could use a ladder, right? And again, these are things that probably, if you're thinking about it, like, yeah, those are obvious things that you would choose to do. And they are. But it's because of those experiences and stuff. But you also need to know what kind of light bulb that the light's going to need. Because if you get up there and you have the wrong light bulb, then you're not going to be able to change it. So then you have to be like, okay, how do I make sure I have the right light bulb? What if you have never changed this light before? How do you make sure that you know if you have the right light bulb or not, right? Well, I'll check the light bulb. But these are the stages and steps of figuring this out. Right? How do you know if it's a good idea, what's a good idea or bad idea on how to change the light bulb? Like if I'm going to try to get up there and I take a chair that has wheels and it's on a hardwood floor, is it a good idea to use that chair it will elevate me, but is it a good idea? No, because it's not safe. The chair could roll out from underneath you, and you could fall and hurt yourself. Well, how do we know that? Because we have experiences with those type of chairs, right? Someone who's never had an experience with that type of chair might not make that connection, or maybe they will when they start rolling it over. But there's plenty of people who don't and stand on it anyways and hurt themselves, right? But these situations, this type of situation is usually resolved through informed decisions. And if we have a lot of like situational background information from day-to-day life of things that we've been around and involved with, it's low-level critical thinking. But if you take that and put into a situation of how do I make an informed decision when it's based on something that I've had no experience on, it moves into higher level critical thinking, because now you have to solve the problem with informed decisions based on something that you don't have this plethora of knowledge on that you do with the light bulb, for example. The next skill is considering options. Essentially, in order to figure out what type of action or course of action to take, and you have to then decide to which is the best choice to pick, right? You have to be willing to find additional options, because a lot of times people don't even go that far. They have one option and that's all they know, and so that's what they use, right? A good critical thinker is going to analyze based on learned knowledge, observational knowledge, however you're going to find this information. And even the asking questions part, are there other ways to do this? Am I doing this the best way possible? Are there other answers to this question, right? Is this the only answer? It's the only answer that I know of, but how do I know that it's the only answer? Are there other options? And then if you find other options, being able to weigh those options and through your informed information to make an informed decision, essentially, right? Because now you're saying, based on the knowledge of research, of sources, of different methods, I can now examine each option to decide, and this is the analysis part of that too, which is the step 3 or the third key skill, is that I can decide, okay, now that I have these options, let me analyze them and decide what is the best option, which uses all of these other skills within that too. Right, and that's again where the light bulb is something that you don't have to analyze very much, because it's so ingrained in you on how to change a light bulb. And it's happened so many times while you've been around, you've seen it successfully changed over and over. You already know what the steps that need to be taken in order to successfully replace the light bulb. This changes, as I mentioned, when it's a new situation, right? And so then this case, brain teasers are a good example of this skill. I'm also going to put down here, this is the idea of you slow down and don't jump into a conclusion, right? Because what happens is when people make snap decisions, especially if it's not something that you're like, well, I've done this 100 times and it's worked out 100 times, so I don't need to think about it any further. But if it's something else that I'm like, okay, my gut instinct tells me it's this, and I'm going to jump right into that and just go with it. I'm not going to look at other options. I'm not going to consider other things. I'm just going to barrel through and go as fast as possible to achieve this. That's when mistakes are made, right? And brain teasers are a good example of this, because if you do a brain teaser and you read through the brain teaser quickly and jump quickly to an answer, you're usually wrong, because brain teasers are meant to misdirect and mislead you. That's part of the whole trick, right? You always kind of feel like brain teasers are kind of like little tricks. and to try to get you and stuff, because you didn't slow down and stop to think and analyze the different options and ways to approach the situation before you provided an answer, thus creating the mistake. So I'll give you an example. The first one is: a rooster is on the roof of a barn facing east. The wind is blowing to the west at 10 miles per hour. The rooster lays an egg. Which direction does the egg roll? So think about that for a minute. What direction does the egg roll based on the information that's been provided? So I'll give you just a second to think about what would your answer be. Or if you don't know the answer, that's fine. How would you start to solve this? What are the steps you would take to figure this brain teaser out? All right. The answer is there would be no egg because it's a rooster, right? And the rooster are the male chickens. So this is, again, jumping into that, rereading the question, looking at it closely. It's easy to skip over, and this is the trick part of it, right? It's easy to skip over because they say a rooster. They actually say rooster twice, so they don't just say it once. But it's not what you're focusing on because they misdirect you with a bunch of detail, right? It's on the roof of a barn facing east. There's that unnecessary detail. It doesn't actually help us in answering the question. But we focus on it because it sounds like it's important. The wind is blowing to the west at 10 miles per hour. Again, more information that then sounds like I need to know. And then my brain's thinking, oh, this is a math problem. Well, crap. Now I've got to figure out math and on this, and then it's not. and so my brain skips over the rooster part of this statement, which is then where you should question, well, wait a minute. Do roosters lay eggs? Are roosters are they well, I mean, I guess if you say, are they hens? But then no, because it's a rooster. But right, what is a rooster? Okay, it's a male chicken. Male chickens don't lay eggs. Therefore, the whole point of the question is just that there is no egg because it can't lay one. But again, it's so easy to just kind of blow past the rooster part where you don't stop to think about the whole thing. And this is where the analyzing and slowing down comes into it, because it really is a process of working through systematically the entire brain teaser and picking out and trying to make sure you find every relevant statement in it. Here's another. You are in a dark room with a single match. The only objects available to you are a candle, an oil lamp, and a gas stove. Which item do you light first? So again, how would you approach this brain teaser? What are the kind of steps that you might take? What is the answer? Right? And you can always pause here if you want to try to get it before I tell you. I guess I didn't warn you to pause for the rooster one. But if you want to try to figure this one out before I say it, pause, think it over, and come up with an answer, and then unpause the video. So the answer is, and again, did you pick candle, oil lamp, or gas stove? Well, those would be incorrect, because the answer is you light the match first. But see, the misdirect is they didn't provide us with that option, right? When they listed which item do you light first, it comes right off of them listing candle, oil lamp, and gas stove. So we stop thinking about the match, because that is now moved beyond that to this list. And they've given me this list, so it must be this list that I'm supposed to pick from. And so then you hyper-focus on that list, and you stop thinking about the rest of the brain teaser in the process. Again, brain teasers are meant to trick. They're meant to misdirect. But the way that you solve brain teasers is that you analyze them, you methodically analyze them. You go through step by step, and you look at everything that's being said, and you break it down until you make sure that you're not missing something. Because like I said, almost every time someone jumps into a brain teaser, unless they've heard it before, they're going to miss an important piece of that, because it's set up to intentionally have that happen, right? That's the whole point of the brain teasers. But it is that critical thinking that this allows you to answer the brain teaser. All right, the next thing is why critical thinking is important. So with this, we are bombarded, as it says here, with things that cloud our ability to know what's important and accurate. And we're bombarded with these things every single day. Misinformation, mixed messages, sound bites, viral videos, memes, fake news, scams, and even more than that. even just the flood of information, especially with like the creation of the cell phone and internet, and apps, we are constantly presented with so much information, way more than people had access to before the internet, before cell phones, right? It's thousands of times more the amount of information that's being thrown at us. So just the sheer number of things that come at us provides a barrier in that sense of critical thinking, because you now have to, it's the same thing of like if you're given a page and you're told there is this one key statement on this page, find it. You are going to be able to do that a lot faster than the person who's given 50 pages and said, in these 50 pages, one of the pages has this important statement, find it. Well, of course, the person who has a smaller amount of information to search through is going to be able to find that. Now, again, that's somewhat opposite of the idea of, hey, that you should be looking for more information to make an informed decision. But there's a balance, right? You can have too little, but you can also have too much, especially if it's fluff, right? Misinformation, mixed messages, memes, fake news, scams, those are all things that are intentionally trying to cause confusion. And because of that, right, it creates it tells us why critical thinking is important, because critical thinking provides us with the tools to navigate this, to know how to, right? So why is critical thinking important here? We'll put, it helps us navigate all of the information, right? You can easily get overwhelmed by the amount of information that's coming at you all the time. But if you're able to critically think, then you can start sifting through and navigating through this, right? It's the ability to sift through that and understand what's accurate and what's not. And that's a key part of it too, is there are people who can't decipher, correct versus incorrect information. Because they haven't practiced critical thinking skills on how to tell the difference. If you are someone who has done that in the past or regularly does that, sometimes you'll be able to. Sometimes hopefully you'll have a suspicion, right? For example, scams, and we're gonna have a section on scams too. Scams have gotten super sophisticated, and to the point that that even people who are adept at spotting scams sometimes have to stop and look at an email or a text and think about it. There are emails where like they are using what is identical layout and logos and information, even the correct number to call, supposedly that it's telling you to click on to call, and they list the number, looks like the correct number, so that it looks like it's an official email from that company. And to the point that you have, every time you get one, essentially it's, okay, what is this saying? What is this telling me? Is this something that's trying to get me to click on a link from this email? Is it trying to get me to call this number that they're providing for me? Right? And what are ways that I can check to see if this is accurate versus, like, there's some obvious scams, like the Nigerian princes that had badly spelled emails were so obvious because they were poorly done. It didn't require a lot of critical thinking skills to see that this was clearly off. Today's scams are far more sophisticated and really do require you to sift through everything to determine and have the skills to do so. So again, the idea of, okay, this is saying Amazon charged me for these 3 items, or that my thing is going to renew, but no, I canceled it, right? Okay, how can I check this? One is to have some knowledge of scams and go, never click on the link, never call the number that's given to you. And then go from there and say, well, how can I check it without doing that? Well, I can go to my Amazon account and look directly in the account. I can go to my Apple account, look directly in the account. I can go to whatever account and look directly in that account and see if there's a problem at the account level, right? And if there isn't, then I know that that email or text was a scam and I can dismiss it. scams, they get more sophisticated than that. Well, again, we are going to talk about it more. Like, they do use fear tactics and isolation if they get you on the phone. So there is an element of that. It's not all just sophistication of presentation. They very much use fear and isolation once they have you on the phone. But there's that initial phase to get you in the door, if you will, right, on that and stuff like that. So how do we make sure we don't fall into the trap of believing fake news, believing scams, being susceptible to misinformation and mixed messages? Critical thinking, right? Being able to, one, acknowledge that this seems off. This is not consistent with what I know about this information. If someone makes a claim about something, I'd be like, that doesn't sound right. I was pretty sure it was this. Well, I guess I need to go look further into this to determine whether that is accurate or not, right? The next thing is, oops, I skipped way down here. This is where the asking questions I mentioned before come in for how to do this. Asking those questions. How do you know? How do you know that? What evidence do you have to support what you're saying? Are there alternatives to your points of view? By asking these questions, it's the easiest way to start the critical thinking. Okay, so what critical thinking can do for you? It can enhance your ability to analyze. Right, analysis is examining something in detail to determine if it's a logical conclusion. Right, this is well, of course, an example of analyzing, the ability to analyze. When you go to the doctor, you have a cough or a fever or other symptoms. They analyze the symptoms based on the knowledge that they learn from experience and from education, right, and practice. And then they make informed decisions based on the possibility that the symptoms indicate a certain ailment or sickness. And then they tell you what actions to take. So they're not just, it's not like they just have one option. There, different diseases, different issues can have similar symptoms. So how do you determine if it's this ailment or this other ailment that have a lot of crossover symptoms? That's through analysis, through sitting there and saying, okay, what do these symptoms present? What are the differences in these symptoms between these two? What's most likely for this person to have? Are there other things that give away whether it's this, sickness or this sickness? And do they have that? All of that takes part of that. The next is promote a clear understanding. This is connected to the analytical skill for sure. Being able to methodically analyze leads to better understanding of a situation, no matter what. The more that you go into it, the more that you're going step by step, you're going to have a clear understanding of the topic when you're done. And that is important. Breaking down the various aspects, finding facts, looking for sources, being able to explain the situation, all of that then is going to provide a clear conclusion that you understand based on that analysis. It instills patience. If you practice critical thinking on a regular basis, as mentioned, it forces you to slow down. It forces you to go through these steps and think, and that requires patience. People who struggle with critical thinking don't want to stop and think about an issue or something they read or a topic. They just want to make a quick decision and move on. But that's usually because of a lack of patience, a willingness to stop, to slow down, to do the work to make sure you make the right decision, essentially. Right, and that creates patience, allows you to be patient in daily life, essentially. It can also spark creativity. Basically, critical thinking often requires you to think outside of the box, to come up with, a solution to things. And the more that you kind of can think of creative ways of solving problems, the more creative you are in other aspects of your life as well. It prevents mistakes. Mistakes often happen when we don't go any further, right? Example, Winston Churchill quote, right? They didn't dive deeper into the quote to make sure that it actually was from Winston Churchill. When we make snap judgments and decisions, we tend to make mistakes because we aren't rationally thinking through the entirety of the issue. And fake news works on this whole premise of this. The other thing, of course, is if you we make more mistakes when we're distracted, because when we're distracted, we're less likely to critically think. And so fake news plays on this distraction and misinformation. They also rely on people to take what they're being told at face value. Again, especially if it aligns with your particular belief system that you already have. Most people are going to accept what's being told to them, even if it is blatantly false. Even if they are presented with evidence that says, hey, this person's full of crap. They're not saying anything that's accurate. They'll be like, nope, because I know that this is correct. And of course, fake news, and actually politicians and things like that. One of the things that they do is that they play it off as like, this person's trying to deceive you, right? Or look, this is just what they do. It's that fear, like this person's trying to challenge you. And they create fear around it, which just heightens people's unwillingness to look at other options or opinions and things like that. And then it helps you look beyond the obvious. When we get into familiar, comfortable thinking and actions, things that are habitual, we're more likely to make poor decisions because we stopped critically thinking at some point, because we got so used to the situation, to the decision that had to be made, that we stop looking at it any further. So familiarity can be helpful in critical thinking, or it can hinder critical thinking. Because what it leads to, habitual thinking leads to automated responses, right? Where we just respond and react without stopping to think an issue through. Whereas critical thinking has you intentionally stopping and slowing down, even if you're familiar with it, right? That's the difference. I'm familiar with this information, so I don't need to look further. Versus, well, I'm familiar with this. This gives me some background knowledge, but I should probably look further into this, look beyond what's the obvious answer, and see if there's any other options or answers out there, and then start analyzing whether those are good or not. And that is the important part of being able to see beyond just the obvious answer. The next thing then is looking at critical thinking in daily life. This is just a list of ways that things that people do in life, where we should use critical thinking. Not everyone does. Where you should use critical thinking, right? So when you're on any online content, digital media, social media, you should be using critical thinking. The problem is that, social media and other online content is created to have you mindlessly scroll. It is set up to become addicting. It is set up to prevent critical thinking because they want to sell you things. They want to get you invested so you keep coming back, right? Or people who get sucked in by likes and clout, right? And so they stop critically thinking but if I post this, if I say this, it gets likes, right? Versus, well, I'm watching so much social media and I keep seeing over and over this repetitive nature of these viral videos coming in, and they all are saying the same thing. So now, so many people said it must be true, and I stopped critical thinking. But the key is it's designed to make us not critically think. So being a good critical thinker helps you interact with these. Voting is a huge one in terms of political campaigns are filled with lies, inaccuracies, and deception, all in the name of getting your vote. They don't care a lot of the times, not everyone, but a lot of the politicians don't care if what they're saying is true or not, as long as it's going to get them into power. It's meant to manipulate information to make their viewpoint seem convincing, to seem like the right choice for you. And being able to critically think allows you to see through that fog, to recognize when someone is making a statement that isn't true, when they're promising things they can't actually produce. And it's gotten to the point where there are politicians that definitely their entire purpose is to create misinformation over action and change, because they don't really have any key policies or things they want to do. They just want to complain, to argue, to criticize, to make people doubt, to make people question, and they don't have a problem lying to accomplish that in the process. And so it can be brought up. These people are lying. This individual, everything that comes out of their mouth is false. And yet people will still believe them. Even when there's tons and tons of proof that what they're saying is not true, they will believe them. And the reason? Because there's a lack of critical thinking. I'm not going to go, that's longer than I wanted the lecture anyway, so I'm not going to go through all of these. It is in the lecture notes. I did provide some additional aspects, but the key with these is this is a small list of things in daily life that can influence. Critical thinking can make better. And there's so many more. I could have put pages and pages of how critical thinking impacts our daily life. And so the purpose of that is just to know, like, critical thinking is important. And almost everything you do in your life, you're going to be impacted by critical thinking. And then lastly, here are skills of a good critical thinker: the ability to analyze, interpret, inference, evaluation, explanation, problem solving, decision making, self-regulation. Again, analysis is one of the main skills of a critical thinker. The key is asking questions. So example, the carnivore diet is super popular. It's not super popular. It's popular enough that it pops up in feed enough of the times. And a carnivore diet is where you're just eating all meat, or meat products, and nothing else. No fruits, no vegetables, it's all just meat. And even then, not a lot of spices or sauces, just meat. Maybe a tiny bit of salt. And if they're extreme carnivore, on the extreme carnivore diet, they eat sticks of butter. So the thing with this is that some of the claims that are being made is that it's healthier for you. It gives them more energy. This is why they do it, right? Because I've lost weight on this diet. It is super healthy for you, and it has given me so much energy. So the analysis then is, if the claim is people who follow this diet are healthier, they lose weight, and they have more energy than people who don't. How do you analyze these claims, right? Instead of just accepting it at face value, how do you determine if these claims are actually true? And that's where the analysis comes in, where you go through and you sift through and you figure out whether or not what they're saying is actually factual. Interpretation is being able to interpret that information that you're learning to make an informed decision and interpret it correctly. So back to the carnivore diet, right? You know someone on a carnivore diet who has lost weight. So your interpretation is, therefore, it must be healthy because they have lost weight. Did you make the correct interpretation of events? How do you know, right? Well, no, you didn't. And we're going to look more into this. This will be one of the sections with this kind of false assumption or premise that of these connecting pieces that A leads to B, and you have to actually make sure that's actually true. Just because someone loses weight on a carnivore diet does not mean it's healthy. Why? Well, because people lose weight with unhealthy things all the time. How do we know they're losing weight because of being healthy, and they're not losing weight because they're not eating enough nutrients and things that they need, right? How do we know that it's actually giving them more energy, right? Versus just them saying it does, right? Some of those carnivore diet videos, they're like, oh, this is awesome. It tastes so great and it's so great for you. And then they eat it and they're almost trying not to gag while they're eating it, pretending it's so tasty and good. And just even watching them, we're like, well, according to your body language, your body's telling me this is not tasty and good. Your mouth is saying it is. Your body is saying, no, this sucks. And I bet you did not finish eating that once the camera went off. But even in the sense of just how do I interpret if I'm making a conclusion interpretation, how do I know that it's the right one? That versus if I'm making the conclusion that, well, because I know this person's on the carnivore diet and they've lost weight, and they claim they have more energy, and that it's good for them, therefore it must be healthy, right? No, well, we don't actually know, and it isn't. There's potential long-term consequences to staying on a carnivore diet long-term, but that's not talked about. So how do I make sure I can make those interpretations, right? Inference, like it's similar to interpretation. Inference is the means of reaching a conclusion on the basis of some form of reasoning. So essentially, you're making a connection based on reasoning and logic, usually based and backed by some reliable information or evidence. We fail at inference when we jump to conclusions, right? Critical thinking protects us against this kind of jump to conclusion and tendency to want to skip ahead. Evaluation. Evaluation is basically, in order to determine and make an informed decision, you have to evaluate the evidence you discover. So if I start researching the carnivore diet, I now have all this information or evidence. How do I know its value? How do I know what to believe? Well, I start by evaluating it. Is it something that is truly of value, this article or what this doctor is saying, or is it something that's just someone posting a video saying it that's looking for likes, right? How do I, and that's obviously an obvious difference. It could just be like, hey, this one source is not a reliable source because there's no vetting of what they're posting, versus this is from a journal for medicine, a journal of medicine. Well, the Journal of Medicine is probably going to be pretty accurate because they have a vetting process for what gets there. The person has to write using sources. An individual person's blog has none of that, right? And then the next is explanation. After you have all of the important information and details and you've evaluated it through analysis, interpretation, and inference, you need to seek an explanation. What does it mean? Now that I have this evaluation and I've done all of this work through inference and interpretation, to expand on the interpretation, essentially, what's the meaning of this information? Is there a general principle at work? What did I learn that will apply to similar situations in the future? In some ways, explanation is being able to share and explain why the work you've done in critical thinking and the research you've done is reliable. Problem solving. Critical thinking helps you not only identify problems, but then go through the process of figuring out how to solve the problem, right? And that's through asking questions, through doing all these other steps. And then lastly, decision making. This is kind of the main purpose of critical thinking, usually, is you choose to critically think about something because you're trying to make a decision. And I had self-regulation on there too. But I'll explain that one briefly too. So decision making, though, the idea is I'm trying to critically think because I need to come to a decision about something. How do I decide if something is accurate? How do I decide who to believe, right? And this is important because when we make wrong decisions, it can have significant impact on our life, right? If we are quick to judge, make rash judgments, it can have a negative influence on jobs, on life, on finances, right? A quick rush to judgment might have you falling for the scam. A rush to judgment and not critically thinking might have you back a politician who has none of your interest in mind, right? A rash decision could lead you buying a junker car because it was cheaper, that breaks down a week after you buy it. So that's the kind of important thing of that. Self-regulation is just that, again, it kind of goes with the idea of patience, that by being an active critical thinker, It gives us a chance to regulate and slow down, to control your choices and actions that you make, rather than being driven by emotion, driven by influenced by what's popular. You can regulate yourself to stop and saying, hey, we need to look at this first. I need to sift through everything to make that decision, not just be swept up in a wave of emotion of what's popular, what looks cool, and then make a decision based on that irrational idea. And I have more self-control and regulation because I'm practicing critical thinking. All right, I'm sorry it's longer than I wanted it to be, but I hope it gives you a really good overview of what the things that we're going to be diving into for this semester, because these are all the different things that we're kind of going to be addressing, we're going to be looking at, and understanding further. And hopefully you came away with realizing how important critical thinking is in your life, in kind of everything we do. So that's it. Have a good week.